Welcome to another video of the series on how to animate any droid or object with Bottango and an Arduino. This time we will cover how to add sound to our setup. There are many options out in the market on how to play sound. For availability reasons and simplicity reasons, I decided to add the DFPlayer Mini to my setup, and this video will cover how to physically connect the DFPlayer to your Arduino and what changes you need to apply in Bottango to play the sounds stored on the SD card which is inside the DFPlayer. Let's start with the wiring of the DFPlayer to our Arduino. To keep the image a bit more simple, I removed all the other connections that were there in the previous videos, so servos and LED strip. So let's go through the wiring connection by connection. If you look at the DFPlayer rotated 90 degree, you will see a lower row of pins and the upper row of pins, and there's a little notch on the DFPlayer that needs to point to the left side. From a wiring aspect, we will just use the lower row of pins. Let's start by connecting the very first one from the left side, left lower side of the DFPlayer, and connect this VCC pin with our 5-volt power source. DFPlayer RX will be connected with port 11 of our Arduino, and DFPlayer TX will get connected to pin 10 of the Arduino. Our speakers plus and minus will get connected to the DFPlayer ports called SPK_1 and SPK_2. Last but not least, the ground of our DFPlayer Mini will get connected with the ground of our 5-volt power source. This concludes the wiring part. The other activities will have to happen in Bottango and in our Arduino IDE, as source code changes will need to be applied again. What we need to do now is import our sound files into Bottango. This is mainly for using the sound file and its duration in our animation to tell Bottango when to start a certain sound file. There is a decoupling of these sound files that we import here and the ones that are on our DFPlayer, but I will explain that in a few minutes. So first, let's start by importing our sound file. And just for simplicity reasons, we will define to put it live. But what is more important is that we select play on hardware. Otherwise, the sound file will be played on your computer running Bottango. But in our model, we want to have those things decoupled, because I definitely don't want to have my computer being connected to my Droid all the time, but I want the Arduino to be autonomous in playing it. So this is what we have to do for importing the sound file. Let's not forget to give the imported sound file a identifier. In our case, I will just call it SND1. Let's change to the animate view of Bottango. You can, or what you need to do now is add a new track to our animation. And in the dialog box for the create a new track, you select a audio or video track and our file that we imported on the previous screen. It will show up in your timeline and you can move it over to whatever moment in time in your animation that you want this sound file to be triggered. As with our LEDs in the previous video, the first thing we need to do to be able to change the Bottango driver source code to play our sounds is add a library to our Arduino IDE. For this, go into the library manager of Arduino IDE and search for the library called DFPlayer. Then install the DFPlayer Mini library. With the installation of the library completed, we can now look into our source code and start changing Bottango Arduino callback.cpp. Before we get into changing the source code, I need to quickly come back to the situation that we have with the decoupling of the sound file that we used in Bottango and the sound files that you need to put on the SD card of DFPlayer. These are actually two separate things. We can import more or less any sound file in Bottango and play any other sound file over the DFPlayer. It would absolutely make sense to use the same file, especially if you're very particular on timing. So the sound file that you modeled or imported into Bottango should at least have the same length as the file that you want to play via your DFPlayer. What we need to take care, and what's the only common denominator is the identifier of the sound file. When you remember, when you imported the sound file in Bottango, you gave it a identifier. In our case, it was SND1. And the source code changes that we will have to apply will also use SND1 to identify a sound file. And then in the source code that we are creating here, you will have to decide which sound file of your SD card you want to play if the identifier SND1 gets triggered. So let's get into the source code. We have to apply changes to the file Bottango Arduino callback.cpp in 3 different locations. Right at the beginning, we have to define a few definitions for sound and instantiate the software serial and DFPlayer Mini instance. I will add a link to the source code's fragments that you see here in the video description, so no need for you to copy and paste from the screen. The first function we need to change is on effector registered. So scroll down in your code until you find it. This function is called when as the name said, an effector gets registered. And that's what we're doing here. We're looking for the effector called SND1 and we'll create or instantiate the class for my DFPlayer so that in the later programs we can just call the DFPlayer to play music. All those lines starting with serial.println are just for debugging purposes. You can leave them in the source code, but you can also delete them. They don't create any harm. The next function you will have to change is called onTriggerCustomEventTriggered. That's the callback function that gets called by Bottango when the sound file or the effector is being used in the animation. So the same logic as we did with the LEDs applied here. We have to verify if the callback function got called for our effector. That's why we have the string compare for SND1 in here. And then we use myDFPlayer.volume to set a volume. You can use any number from 0 to 30. And myDFPlayer.play, in my case 1. So let's pause a bit here and talk about DFPlayer and the sounds on the DFPlayer or the sound files. I can only highly recommend you to search for the instructions for the DFPlayer and how to put the sound files on the DFPlayer. It for some reason doesn't use a proper file system with naming, but it orders the files in the sequence they get copied onto the SD file. And they also require a naming convention, 4 digits and then dot mp3 or WAV. So the first file that you would expect is 001.mp3, the second one would be 0002.mp3, etc. If you copy those files in a different order on the SD card, the file that you copy first, that might be called number 7, would be called by this function if you ask him to play the first file, because it got copied first onto the SD card. So therefore I can only, if you don't want to get into a total mess, recommend you to pay close attention on how you put the files on your SD card, how you name them. So in this case, we're calling number 1, which is this file that I also want to play. And that more or less concludes everything that you need to do to change the driver for Bottango. You can upload it now onto your Arduino and use the usual magic of Bottango to get your droid animated and now playing sound. This concludes this video, and I hope it was helpful for you. If it was, I would greatly appreciate a thumbs up, just as feedback for me and the work that I'm putting in creating these videos. And if you don't want to miss any new releases, please also hit subscribe. I have no intention of making money out of these videos. If for whatever reason they should still get monetized, all profits that I will make out of these videos will be donated to an official charity organization. See you at the next video.